Good to see you. Good to meet
See you too.
I was thinking it's very difficult. Actually, the next subject matter is very abstract and very difficult to explain. But I would start by saying that music is not made the traditional way anymore.
That's correct.
And I let you take it out from there.
Sure, and it's one of the challenges actually in terms of tracking who owns what, so that's what I'll talk about. Okay, so when I first migrated to Boston from my home country of Cyprus in 1991, this was in fact the world's largest record shop. So all those 4 floors you see up there were full of records, and it looked kind of like this inside. And of course, all those records, every single one of them, can fit into one of these. It's pretty unbelievable when you think about it. And then when I was a kid, this is what we called a band. 4 people got together and they played music. I've shown this slide to a lot of people under the age of 20. They're not always sure who this band is. I'm hoping this audience recognizes it. Today, this is a musician, doesn't play a traditional instrument, right, in terms of the way that we recognize it. You can even make music without even, in fact, being a musician. Every one of your phones has an amazing instrument built into it. You can even make music without even being an actual human being. This is IBM Watson. It's IBM's artificial intelligence machine. And about a year ago, it was able to ingest information from headlines from the New York Times, the LA Times, Wikipedia entries, got information from the top songs from the last half a century from Billboard, and was able to derive harmonic and melodic structure, juxtapose all that information against social media to feel how people were emoting or feeling about it, and was able to compose a song that actually charted in number 30 in the Billboard charts. Pretty amazing. And, you know, this is one of my heroes. This is actually what got me into music, seeing this guy on TV. But you'll see that once upon a time, that's how we enjoyed music, using record players. Today, we can access music on our wrists, through virtual reality, intelligent assistants like Google Home, intelligent thermostats like the Nest. Yes, your thermostat can actually sense the environment around you and make music recommendations. And this is an app that just got released to the market, but it can sense your biometric data that your body emits and actually customize music entirely based on you. And this is primarily for stress relief or to get a better sleep. So my point here is that things are changing really, really, really quickly. How we make music, how we enjoy music. And to some degree, this reflects not just the music industry, but in fact, I think society. Things are changing so rapidly, we can barely keep up with it. In the music industry, the underlying infrastructure looks more like this. It actually, it's barely standing. It's about to crumble because it's an analog industry in a digital world. It actually predates the invention of the radio, most of the infrastructure of the industry in terms of the way that rights owners are identified. It predates the radio. It predates the invention of the phonograph. It actually dates back to the invention of this particular thing called the player piano. Has anybody ever seen a player piano? Interesting. If you ever seen one of those pianos that play themselves, that's a player piano. And in the late 19th century, this was actually as revolutionary as an iPod because it was the first time ever that people were able to enjoy music without physically having to be present in front of a performer. So this was the first time that new constructs about the way that music or musicians or composers were able to get paid, this is when these new constructs were coming about. I'm not going to go through this diagram, but if you're a musician, you're expected to kind of figure this out. But there's all kinds of ways that you're able to make money. And just to put it in perspective, a global hit, if you take a Taylor Swift song, can have a 700,000 different ways of making money. It's pretty insane, right? It's radios and in cars and in elevators and smartphones and greeting cards and just about anything you can imagine, movies. And at its worst scenario, there's as many as 50 different companies in between the person that listened to the music and the person that actually made it. So you can imagine complexity, a lot of people involved, lack of a common way of sharing this information, lack of an agreement. What happens? Well, a lot of money just doesn't make its way to the people that make music. Coupled with the fact that social media is exacerbating the sharing of music, and this has led for many performers to basically a desert field. So about a year ago, we got together with our friends from the MIT Media Lab, and we said, okay, there has to be a way for us to sort of reimagine the way that the technological underpinnings of the music industry work so that we are able to all identify rights owners the exact same way. And this gave birth to the Open Music Initiative, but the main objective that we have is to, in effect, create an open protocol. What's that? An agreement between all the participants in the music industry about the way to share data. And if you're wondering what's a protocol, think that every time you send an email, any client, right, it doesn't matter what you're using, whether you're using Google's email application or Microsoft's email application or Apple's email application, there's interoperability. They all talk to one another, so you don't really care. Your email just finds its way. Open protocols make that possible. Anybody can write an application to that. As long as it's compliant, the information goes to the right person. The same way with the way that you're accessing wireless right here, the way that you're accessing the web. All these open standards are what has catalyzed innovation. Interestingly, in terms of identity or in terms of rights ownership, there is no such standard, right? Your identity is not owned by you online. It's owned by Facebook and Google and Amazon and everybody else. So we brought together gradually over 200 companies from across the music industry in order to be able to accomplish this understanding of creating the shared way of identifying rights ownership across the industry. So far to date, over 200 companies joined. This involves all the major labels like Warner, Sony, Universal, companies like Spotify, Pandora, YouTube, SoundCloud, in America, Sirius XM, Netflix. And we used in many ways the neutrality of academia to bring all these people together. We've had a number of gatherings over the last year, and trust me, getting all these people together in a room, it may be easier to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict than solving the music industry conflict. But the main objective has been to create interoperability, a common way to share data about one thing. Who owns a piece of music? And as I mentioned earlier, because of all these different ways of new music being created, it's not easy to identify rights ownership because a major hit could have as many as 8 different people that contributed to make it. So you have to figure out ways to send money to all these different people. We released an API late last year. What's an API? Just think of it as software that enables this interoperability to happen. But very importantly, we're finding that blockchain technology, how many of you have heard of blockchain? Okay, very few people in the crowd. Well, I wasn't prepared to do a primer about blockchain, but I'll make it really simple for you. Think of it as a system that enables people to share information or share information about transactions with one another, but instead of a central authority owning that information, everybody that's participating in the system owns it. And it has some very important attributes. The first being that anything that's recorded, you can always track it back to that initial entry. So in English, it's called immutable. You cannot change a record. So when you look at Wikipedia, for example, you can track the very first person that made an entry. What blockchain enables people to do is for every transaction that's happening online, you can actually trace it back to the very first person that contributed that entry. So when you think of music, if you capture information about the creator, irrespective of where that information goes, you can always trace it back to that originator. So this technology, which many of you have heard applications like Bitcoin, for example, being built on top of it, in our view, it will fundamentally change the way that we interact with the internet over the next decade, frankly. It will shift just about everything. We're applying this technology in music to help identify rights ownership. In order to accelerate adoption, we've created a series of summer labs where we recruited students from different universities from across the world to come together with artists, and this was one of the first projects that we collaborated with the Inter-American Development Bank, where we brought artists from the Caribbean to collaborate with artists and come up with different possible prototypes. So one of them was, can you identify rights ownership during a live DJ remix? So think when you go to a club and a DJ is changing records, can you identify who owns that? Why is this important? Because every time that a song gets played, somebody has to get paid. Another one was, can you take a mashup, a hip-hop mashup, right, that basically people take a drum loop and a bass line and a vocal from different tracks, throw them together, put them on YouTube, another kid comes and records something else and shares it with their friend on Twitter. Can you track identity? So this is what we've been working on doing the last year. And in terms of how we see this fundamentally changing things, first, we think that blockchain technology will completely shift the pendulum away from what I'll call just the distributors, which are the big major tech companies, but also will give, I will say, power back to the originators of information. Every one of you puts media and information on the internet, but in fact, you don't own any of that, right? Any of the pictures you're sharing on Instagram right now, Instagram has generated a lot of money from it, you're not getting anything, right? So you're willfully giving your information away. This is what's been happening with musicians. With blockchain technology, we see the pendulum swinging back a bit. If you think about it, of the 5 major companies on the American Stock Exchange, which on any given day would be Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, none of these are companies that are necessarily creative businesses, right? So while in the meantime, the music business has been more than halved over the last 20 years. We also envision an explosion of creativity to take place. Think of every sound that's ever been created, right? Take any sound, not just any song, but any sound. Every bass line, every drum kick, every guitar lick. Think if that's available to people to create and develop new music on top of it in the same way that open source is a new way for people to make software. Think what can happen as long as you can track ownership to the rightful owners. Think of all the music that we could be creating together, and think of who could be creating that music. It doesn't just have to be professionals. For people who make music, imagine platforms that enable them to track in real time everywhere their music is being performed. Right now, if you're a musician and a restaurant is playing your music, good luck getting paid. You know, restaurants pay money, it goes to a central entity, and then at the end of the year, they distribute money based on some mechanism that frankly nobody really knows, okay? It's just based on sampling. But with this technology, you can have a dashboard as an artist and see in real time whether your song is getting played on a streaming station in South Korea or in a high school marching band is playing it. And then lastly, new experiences, right? There's all these new applications coming about that right now don't have music, largely because licensing is extremely complicated. It costs, if you wanted to start a new streaming service, it would cost you on a minimum $100 million just to get the global licenses. Why? Because you're paying blanket licenses. You're paying for everything, even though you're using very little. So we think that, again, by fundamentally changing the infrastructure of the industry, we can actually help bring innovation in it and help grow it. And lastly, hopefully a lot more revenue streams for creators and people who make music and turn that desert into a fertile land for everybody. If you incentivize creativity, you can only see how much the world can benefit from it. Thank you.
Panos, before you go, what occurs to me is that this would be an ideal system to audit all those involved in the music industry.
Correct. Right now, if you are an artist, actually it's almost impossible to really audit all the different people that are paying you. Your record label, what we call performing rights societies, which are the entities that collect money from all these different places where music is getting played. There's no easy way to audit them.
Now, so it would
Now,
be...
if your livelihood depends on it,
Yes.
and if dollars have become pennies, then you better be able to attribute for every single penny that is due to you.
So we understand that this system monitors where the money goes. Let's imagine
It actually
that
monitors who owns something, who created something.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily monitor where the money goes.
So when we listen to a song on Spotify, can we make certain that all those involved in the creative process are going to be recognized?
So right now, you can't. Spotify has its own way of tracking ownership, but the problem is that there's no, ownership of a song is like owning any other asset. It's bought and sold all the time, right? So a song has two rights associated with it. The sound recording, which comes from a label, that's easy to identify, but then all the people who wrote the song or
Right.
contributed to it also own a copyright. That's called the publishing or the composition. If you're Beyonce on her new record, there's 100 different contributors. Now, any one of those 100 different contributors could sell their share to somebody at some point.
Right.
Unless you have an interoperable system that enables the system in real time to know, this is who owns that. Spotify can't necessarily know who to send the money to, which is the reason why you hear about all these lawsuits, because there's people saying, I'm owed money, and Spotify says, great, I don't know that. So that's part of the challenge.
And we talked about compensation a lot, but I said the word recognition. Does the system also recognize creativity and talent beyond the money aspect?
I think that's maybe the most important thing. Because many times we want to create things, and we're not necessarily looking to just get paid for them. We're creating things because we want to share them with the world.
Right.
But, I actually used a bunch of slides from a bunch of other people's, intellectual property that I can access through what's called a Creative Commons license, right? I'm not selling this. However, in music, there is not really such a construct. So if you can get attribution, let's say, your kid takes a bunch of different people's, bass line and drum sounds and creates something different, records a new vocal, puts it up on YouTube. This happens, this is not science fiction. This
Right.
happens every single
day.
day.
Yeah.
It's impossible right now to necessarily even just attribute who owns or who created that. And I think for most people, it starts with the English word attribution more than it starts with, do I get paid? But
Right.
with blockchain, you can actually determine from the moment you created the uses of your music. And you can say, for all these uses, I don't need to get paid as long as I'm identified.
Right.
But for these other uses, then I want to get paid, and you can even specify that, right? So this is the future that we see.
So attribution goes either to recognition or compensation.
That's correct. And our view is that it can bring a lot more, it can incentivize a lot more people. There's a lot of hobbyists right now, or what the music industry would call hobbyists, that are making music. But, what if they make a particular song really famous, not because of the song itself, but because they added something to it that then they share to their friends, and then they share it to somebody else, and it becomes the next big meme, right? To me, that's a creator who's just as important as the original creator of the song.
Right.
So if you have a system that's recording these transactions, and you can always
You can
trace
go
the
back,
transactions, then everybody along the lines, can effectively get that attribution. Another interesting thing about blockchain, it has this thing called smart contracts, which are basically rules that says, if this happened, this is who gets paid, right? So you can set smart contracts between the people creating a song, and they may say, after the millionth download, so-and-so doesn't get paid anymore because maybe it's a fan who participated in creating something, So think of how much this will change crowdfunding. And this is not just for music, it's in every industry, which is the reason why healthcare companies are looking at it to track medical records. Right now, you don't own your medical record, right? Land registries. Estonia is the first country in the world to put every single one of their citizens on blockchain. So this means that all the information about me, I own, meaning whether I own my house, what my medical records is, whether I graduated from high school, whether I graduated from college. Right now, it's the opposite. All these centralized systems own it. So if you apply for a job and somebody says, well, prove to me that you graduated from college, you actually need to go to your college and beg them to give you, a copy of your degree to be able to prove, with a piece of paper of all things, that somehow you graduated from college. So again, it will reposition the way that we perceive identity. We're applying it onto the music industry, but identity is something that every single person in this room is grappling with. And for me, the biggest challenge is that we've all got accustomed to give up our identity rights to centralized entities like Google and Facebook. Facebook knows more about you than your doctor, right? They know more about you than your school or your mother or you, for that matter.
Right.
So anyway, this is why it's an exciting thing. It's still a work in progress. I mean, next time when you read about blockchain, just remember, this conversation. It's just an illustration.
We thank you for sharing this with us. Panos Panay,
Thank you so
ladies and
much.
gentlemen.